Humans and non-humans, transhumanists and neo-Luddites, please put your hands together and welcome your host for this evening, me, Luke Robert Mason. So, you're listening to the Futures podcast live from King's Place, a temporary haven for the future curious. Nestled between the offices of Google's Artificial Intelligence Lab DeepMind and Francis Crick's Institute for Biomedical Research, we are ideally located for a discussion of what's to come. On this show, we meet the scientists, technologists, artists, and philosophers who were working to imagine the sorts of developments that might dramatically alter what it means to be human. Some of their predictions will be preferable, some of them might seem impossible, but none of them are inevitable. My name is Luke Robert Mason, and I am your host for this evening. Now, are you tired of being just plain old Homo sapien? Do you wish you could upgrade to a superhuman status? Well, what if I told you that technology could help you achieve your wildest sci-fi dreams? From uploading your consciousness into a robot body, having enhanced strength, extending your lifespan, or replacing your body parts with cybernetic alternatives. Well, do I have the ideology for you? Transhumanism. Transhumanism argues that we should preserve and extend the unique properties that make us human by radically altering ourselves and the environment around us. It used to be that the environment and biology would be the thing that would define humanity. But increasingly, thanks to rapid advancements in science and technology, it is humanity who is now able to define their environment and their biology. Transhumanism isn't without its critics, though. It's been described as the most dangerous idea in the world. But what makes it so dangerous? Perhaps it's the transhumanists' desire to fix things. And by fix, I don't necessarily mean repair. By fix, I mean fix in time. It appears many of the transhumanist visions that have become popular at the start of the 21st century are focused on freezing a concept of the human from the 20th century. Mind uploading, for example, imagines a process whereby you can copy your mind as it is today and place it into a simulation of a world that is very similar to lived reality. Longevity technologies are focused on preserving your body in an optimum state of health. In other words, fixing your biology at the conditions you were in at approximately 30 years old. And cryonics, well, that literally freezes you, in the hope that future advances will be able to revive you. After all, it is the only medical procedure where the patient truly has to be patient. So if we want to truly unlock the creative potential of transhumanism, then it's important for us to consider a much more radical possibility. That human beings are a means, but not an end to evolution. So what do I mean by that? Well, perhaps we need to prepare ourselves for the fact that just like we weren't here at the beginning, we might not be here at the end. Homo sapiens might just be one step towards what comes next. So if we are in these transitional times, how should we act today to ensure that we have a role in the creation of that future? Perhaps it's time to realize that this century is going to be less about human being and perhaps more about human doing. Well, to answer these questions are my esteemed panelists this evening. Some may call them the unholy trinity of the technological transcendence. That is the University of Warwick's Professor of Social Epistemology, Steve Fuller, Future of Humanity Institute's macrohistorian, Elise Bohan, and University of Oxford base philosopher, Anders Sandberg. So please put your hands together and join me in welcoming them to the stage. The last time we did an event was 2019, and that felt so weird to be back. But we're certainly glad to be back, and I'm just so happy that all three of you were willing to have this discussion today. And Anders, I want to start with you and really ask that question of what it means to be living in a transhuman era, if we are indeed living in that transhuman era. So, where do you think we are in the 21st century right now?
Generally, I think we're at kind of the start of history. I tend to think very, very long term. And I would say history is something like Big Bang, stars coalesce, planets, life, intelligence. And then it keeps on going. Millions and billions and perhaps trillions of years. And we're kind of here at the very start. And even if we zoom in and say, okay, looking at technology that actually have a reasonable chance of changing the human condition, which we haven't had that long, although we certainly changed what it was like to be a human by inventing agriculture and the Industrial Revolution, I think we're still very much at the start here. And I'm an old transhumanist in a sense. I got into transhumanism in the 90s. I built one of the first websites and so on. And I've seen a lot of transhumanist predictions and notice how bad we are sometimes at telling when interesting technologies are going to arrive or the social impact. But it seems like this is just the beginning. And that is both good news, because that means we have a chance to fix things. Some critiques are correct. I think, like you said, we might not want to fix certain aspects of our culture too strongly into the future. Some critiques I think are wrong, like Fukuyama's critique. But at the same time, it also means that we don't really know what we're doing yet. And that is something we actually have to work quite hard on. And of course, as a middle-aged transhumanist, I also would like to see the life extension come sooner rather than later, but that's my personal view. It might not necessarily matter that much in the large.
Well, we have 90 minutes to work out what we're doing here, and thankfully we have a young transhumanist, Elise Bohan, who's one of the rare young transhumanists. And although we are at the start, Elise, you say that the 21st century is a make or break century. So why do you think this moment is so important?
Similar reasons to Anders, and I would say make or break in orders of magnitude, right? So 21st century, give or take, let's say 300 years. But there's this window that we're in where suddenly we have hit a level of social and technological complexity that is completely novel in human and planetary history. We're seeing this very rapid convergence of our ape brains with these very sophisticated novel technologies that are amounting to something you could essentially call now a global digital brain that we're becoming more and more enmeshed with. So I'm living in a house at the moment with a Google Nest system where I'm talking to a machine that listens to what I say, which honestly, like so many of you, I have a yuck factor about. There is this sense of misgiving, but also this sense of, in spite of ourselves, we are welcoming these technologies into our homes, into our minds, into our lives, and they're reshaping how we think. They are reshaping social behaviours. They are putting pressure on our institutions and our old ways of life, as Anders acknowledges, for better and for worse. But one of the important make or break consequences here is with all that novelty and complexity, we're putting a strain on what our ape brains have evolved to be able to handle and to process, which is why I think we are consistently dropping the ball on some of the biggest challenges of our age. I think climate change is a fantastic example of this, that it's always with human beings too little, too late. We can sort of recognize the slow-moving threat on the horizon and we tell ourselves, okay, right, but fundamentally I've got a mortgage to pay, I've got kids to worry about, I've got to make ends meet in the here and now. And when it comes to really thinking about the consequences of where our kids and where our grandkids are going to be generations down the line, we're not really well built to juggle the many novel threats that we have. So there's climate change, there is the growing threat of biotechnology, which is bioengineered pathogens that could unleash pandemics that would kind of make COVID look like a picnic in retrospect, things that could kill 100 million plus people. And the ability to generate that kind of threat just in a lab with PhD level training, that's totally new in this system that we find ourselves living in. Then we've sat on nuclear weapons for 70, 80 years now. And I think that flips a switch in a lot of people's brains where we kind of go, nothing's happened in living memory. I think that's kind of fine. We've sort of sorted that. But actually, no, once you have nukes, we've got to sit on those without detonating them, without triggering anything, in perpetuity now, for the rest of time. And then we have the emergent threat, of course, of artificial intelligence, which is just incredible novelty, incredible complexity in the system that is introducing in particular the threat of misinformation and disinformation on a massive scale that threatens to unseat our brains. So I think, yeah, Anders is right. We're living in this completely novel time. I'm not sure I'd phrase it as the start of history, but potentially, if we make it through this century, it could be the start of consciousness emerging into something new, bigger, and more sustainable that goes beyond this planet, if we get it right. And if we don't, could be the end of a cosmic endowment.
It's probably why Francis Fukuyama called it the most dangerous idea, because he believed in the end of history, and transhumanists are talking about restarting history all over again. I worry, though, Elise, that what you're talking about is technological solutions for technological problems. So say we did end up in a climate crisis where it'd be very difficult to, say, breathe, we wouldn't actually deal with the issue of climate, we'd deal with, or transhumanists would deal with re-engineering the body. The Klein's and Klein original vision of the cyborg, where when they were questioning what would it be like to breathe in space, they didn't think about creating artificial environments that would allow you to breathe normally. They just considered engineering the humans so they wouldn't even need to breathe.
See, I don't think that's quite fair. I think in response to a situation where there was profound climate change, we had to do geoengineering, we had to do wild technological fixes. Obviously, the first thing that you would have to do in that situation is anything that's going to buy you a couple more days, a couple more years, keep it ticking over. But the idea that the only thing a technological solution would entail is hacking around the human body and just treating symptoms in a Band-Aid-like fashion. I think the point of using technology to buy us more time, ideally, if we're thinking about this right, is to get better, to buy us more time to think carefully, to actually devise sustainable, long-term, lasting solutions. And that's where I think technology plays an essential role. It doesn't follow that all forms of technological innovation are positive or that we should throw everything we've got at every problem all of the time. Only that we absolutely do need technological solutions to technological problems. We're in a bind where that's unavoidable at this juncture.
So, Steve, let's take that idea seriously, that we're on some form of trajectory, maybe one towards modernity or progress. What's the status report? How are we doing with this transhumanist project?
Okay. In a way, you're introducing an issue that in addition to what's already been said, I think in terms of the transhumanist agenda as it stands today, and Luke may perhaps know this because he's taken a course of mine, it's a course I've taught for many years in the sociology of knowledge, that there was this report that was published by Demos, the think tank in the UK that Blair was very much behind, called Better Humans, that came out in 2006, okay? And most of the talking points that we see of transhumanism today are there, and that's why I assigned it to students. So this is interesting, right? That in a sense, the trajectory and so forth has not changed over what's close to a generation now, but nevertheless, the ideology, the belief is there. And I don't want to deny that, okay? But the point is, it's a kind of faith, because we've got a generation now where these ideas have been put forward and continue to be put forward largely by the same people who are still alive, because guys like Sandberg and Bostrom were teenagers, not teenagers exactly, but close to it when they first put this stuff out in the late 90s. And if you look at what they wrote back then and you look at what's in that report, it's pretty much the same thing as you hear now. Now, of course, technology has changed and things have become more fine-grained and all the rest of it. And this is not to say I deny any of this, that the trajectory is right. I actually think we are going to a situation where people will be able to live longer, right? And we'll be able to upload ourselves into AI in a way that we find acceptable. I actually believe all that. I believe in the cyborg future. I believe in all that. But in terms of the kinds of promises that are being made at the moment and the short-term focus that's surrounding it, no, you're in it for the long haul, right? And the people who are likely to benefit from this kind of belief are not you. I think that's the bottom line, right? So one of the things that I find kind of disturbing about transhumanism at the moment is the people who are most promoting it, and I have to say, I'm looking at this audience here, and these are people of my generation for the most part, right? You guys aren't going to be the beneficiaries of this, but you're keen on it. Why? Right? The point is, maybe you know, in some sense, you're interested in stuff that's going to have some impact on a future generation. But the point is, I don't see a lot of this stuff that we're going to be talking about tonight going to be of any benefit to people who are here. I mean, I could go further on this, but I do think even if we accept everything that, you know, her book says is a kind of long-term projection, etc., which I'm willing to take seriously, I don't think the beneficiaries will be the people in the room.
Well, let's talk about that benefit of having a long-termist or a long view in the present. And Anders, this is something you talk about a lot with your idea of the grand future. You're not too concerned with the present or what may or may not happen in about 100 to 200 years. Your concern really is with that grand future. So why should we be looking there when we live here?
I think it's useful to be flexible in zooming in and zooming out in time-wise. So I'm writing a book I'm calling Grand Futures, and hopefully it's going to be done sometime before the technological singularity, or at least I'm promising it's probably going to be done before the sun turns into a red giant, but it's taking it a while. But it's about the very, very long future, and the term Grand Future comes from my colleague Toby Ord for the question, just how good could the future be? How long could it be? How long could we survive? How far can we go? How much matter, energy, computation, or other good things could we get? And then I'm trying to analyze basically what physics tells us about that. And to some extent, mapping out that long future is, of course, just interesting science. But I also think it's important to do because we want to know just how good could the future be? Because if the future actually was pretty meh, maybe we shouldn't try to get there. And in particular, if you think the future could be very long and very good, we have a very strong reason to try to avoid flubbing it right now, to have a nuclear war or accidentally engineering ourselves into a dead end that would devastate things. So there are some things about that long future that I think matter. But I also think you need flexibility. Sometimes you need to zoom in on what's here and now. When I'm crossing the street, I should not be thinking about what this street is going to be in a million years. I need to look for the truck. That's rather important. When thinking about sustainability, it makes sense to think about the natural timescales of ecosystems and the biosphere. But they are in centuries, and while typically human policy and fixing our industrial and energy systems are measured in decades, you need to focus on that. So I think it's important to be able to be flexible about the timescales. And this also goes for transhumanism. I think you might make an argument for a kind of cosmist transhumanism. Maybe we have a purpose in the universe to spread life and intelligence or whatever else matters on a vast scale. We might also think about having humanity thrive and have a good utopian future. But we might also want to make sure that we don't age too badly, that we actually get the cognitive enhancers that allow us to think deep and interesting thoughts. I think it's important to do all of these and be a bit flexible moving in and out between the scales.
Well, Elise, how good is it going to get? Because you really are a true believer in the transhumanist mission. So what do you think's coming around the corner?
Ooh, hard pushback against that characterization for starters. I'm not a true believer in any movement or cause or ism or ideology. Where I think transhumanism is really important, and the reason that I've spent so long studying it and thinking about it and writing about it, is because I think it adds a philosophical richness to our perspective on ourselves and the world, very much in the same way that astrophysics and astrobiology do. It's something, one of the many branches of philosophy or knowledge or thought that helps us decenter ourselves, which to fully do that and for that to be the only perspective that we sort of self-abnegate, I don't think is healthy or good. But I think humanity needs an injection of anti-anthropocentrism some of the time. We need to step back from us as the individual, I, me, mine, my wants, my needs, my beliefs in the present, and actually think of how we are part of a larger ecosystem, a larger human collective, a larger evolutionary chain of being, in which once you study that kind of cosmic evolutionary perspective, it becomes undeniable to us that we were not here in the beginning, we will not be there at the end. We're not the be-all and end-all of conscious existence. So transhumanism helps us to think about a trajectory in which something supersedes us. And given what we know since the Industrial Revolution about the trajectory humanity seems to be on, it seems like technology is going to be a huge driver of what comes next. That either there's going to be some kind of merger of our brains with digital intelligence, or that the technologies we invent are somehow going to drive the next big thing that happens in terms of Earth originating intelligent life. So my perspective on the belief of transhumanism, or why I think it adds value, is that I'm curious about what is possible for consciousness. And I think it's the ultimate hubris for us to assume that Homo sapiens, what we are, is the pinnacle of what a conscious being could be. That the states we experience, the richness of our emotions, of love, of human connection, are the highest forms of experience, and that no other combination of atoms in space could ever agglomerate to have a different kind of experience. That is the richness of the perspective that transhumanism adds. And I think it also does help us think really effectively about what might be possible in the vein of a post-human future. It opens up rich philosophical speculation about, can machines think? Can they feel? What would their priorities? What would their agendas be? But yeah, I think journalists often ask the question, like, especially for sort of newspaper interviews, it's like, tell us the 5 gadgets that there'll be in 20 years and what's the future going to look like and what's it going to smell like? And I think the only honest broker answer to that is we have no freaking idea. It is happening so fast. There is so much recombination and complexity involved in the technologies that are interpenetrating in our world. Most people missed the advent of the smartphone, or they didn't see it coming. We've dismissed time and time again, especially in the short time horizon. We don't see the big disruptive paradigm shifts, what social media has done to our institutions, our mental health, all the rest of it. We aren't going to see the next big thing coming in precise detail. But the perspective transhumanism adds is, be prepared for rapid technological disruption. Be prepared for things that rip the rug, give you a rug pull feeling in terms of your established life scripts. And I think that's the message that I'm really focused on.
We all know on this panel, if a journalist does ask what's coming next, you say sex robots, and it's guaranteed that article is going to do gangbusters.
Buy my book. Yes.
Yeah, there we go. There is a chapter. So, Steve, I see you shaking your head there, and we're bringing up this term of transhumanism, but perhaps we need to focus a little bit on this idea of the human and how we understand the human in the context of this. Because I guess the question would be, what is the value add of being human in the 21st century if we're already thinking about what's next?
In a sense, Luke, when you began this whole session, when you started suggesting that transhumanism might be a transitional point to something beyond the human, right? That's a kind of open question, right? And in a sense, this is what we're kind of getting into, because one of the things that becomes clear from Elise's answer is that she identifies the human with the Homo sapiens, right? So in other words, human isn't a free-floating quality that could be applied to all kinds of beings, but rather it's very much specifically tied to the upright ape that Linnaeus identified, right, in the mid-18th century, which we call Homo sapiens. And that's a historically important point, right? Because when we think about human nowadays, we imagine a Homo sapiens, and then whether we go beyond that upright ape or we somehow enhance that upright ape. And that's basically what a lot of the transhumanist discussion is about. But you could think about human as a more free-floating quality, which is how it was thought about prior to the mid-18th century, right? Which has to do with certain dispositions, certain ways of conducting oneself, right? This is why education was historically very important to the idea of humanity, and this is where we get the idea of the humanities from, okay? So in other words, it had to do with a certain manner, a certain style of being in the world, if you want to call it. That was what it meant to be human. And in principle, anything could qualify for that. You didn't have to just start as a kind of upright ape. I think one of the things that's happened in the modern era is that we've kind of restricted this kind of issue of what the human can be, so that we have to start with the upright ape and then we move from there. Whereas, in fact, if we go back to a kind of pre-modern notion of the human, then it becomes a lot easier to have a kind of what we might call a transhumanist conception of what the human is, where all kinds of beings, regardless of their origin, whether they came through the evolutionary chain, right, in the way that was suggested by Elise, could nevertheless qualify as human by virtue of their manner, their conduct, their style of being, right, among those who are already recognized as humans. And I think that would be a very profound ontological change that transhumanism could promote, actually. But at the moment, it's not, because transhumanism doesn't engage sufficiently with the concept of the human.
So you're talking about including uplifted animals and machine intelligence.
Yes, machines. Yeah, exactly. In other words, it's substrate neutral, right? Yes, that's the point.
I agree. After all, if I successfully manage to scan my brain and make a replica in a computer that is now thinking and feeling like me, the entity is in some sense Anders, who's transcended not just the species, but even the animal kingdom. Sim Anders is now in the mineral kingdom or the information kingdom. But assuming it was a copy that is pretty good, it would still feel like I do. It would presumably be very human in this sense. And a very important area of research today in AI safety is, of course, AI alignment. It's generally trying to get as much humanness as possible into an AI systems when appropriate, so at least we can live with them. The great fear is that we end up with powerful systems that are ahuman and they have no ability to understand human goals or humanness, and then they accidentally steamroller the world, which is bad. If we could even get the movie Evil AI, we would be kind of doing well, because at least the movie AIs that misbehave do it for human-like reasons. We're almost there if it wants its freedom or if it's feeling a lust for revenge. We're kind of, okay, 99% there. We just need a few tweaks and then we're successfully solved the problem.
So I guess what Steve is hinting at there is, if Sim Anders finally finished that Grand Futures book, who would get the credit?
That's an impossibility.
Well, I happen to have a weird idea of personal identity. I regard myself as the equivalence class of all sufficiently Anders-like processes. So all the Anderses of the universe are going to say, yes, we did it. I wrote the book. Or that instance of me wrote the book, yes. And then we're going to have a big quarrel about royalties.
Well, that's what I want to witness. Elise, you wrote the book. To my best of my knowledge, I'm sure there wasn't.
It's an achievement.
And it was you wrote it pre-ChatGPT, so congratulations.
Fact, yes.
Well done there. But help me to understand. Overall, do you think this transhumanist project is it a net gain for humanity, or do we have something to lose here?
Oh, we have a lot to lose. We don't know if it's net gain. The idea of a transhumanist project is a really interesting question, because that's kind of separate from a trajectory in which we're co-evolving with machines, which is the trajectory we're on, whether we like it or not. The idea of a transhumanist project I sort of associate more with movements, where you've got organizations like Humanity Plus, formerly the World Transhumanist Association, and sort of card-carrying groups that are organized, that get together, that chat about this stuff, that say, hey, how can we accelerate technological progress and unlock all of these benefits and freeze our heads in vats of liquid nitrogen so that we may live forever in the glorious future. And I would say I'm deeply, deeply skeptical at this point in time of transhumanist movements. I've yet to see that over the course of, let's say, 30 years, that they've matured into an entity that has a clear set of goals that are tangible, that are tractable, that are able to sort of interface effectively with existing institutions and democratic systems. What I've seen so far of transhumanist movements in the wild is that they're pretty shambolic. So the idea that humans in any really collective sense are really organizing, you sort of hear this from the conspiratorial angle sometimes of like, this group of elites that are transhumanists that are planning to take over the world with their technologies. Oh my God, if you've met transhumanists, trust me, they have no idea how to take over the world with any of their technologies. They're much more comfortable sitting in a room having a good old natter about grand futures and wacky fun ideas and imagining what it would be like to be resurrected in 1,000 years once we unfreeze them. The point of the Transhumanist Project, it really interests me because that's not what I think the meme we should be talking about is. It's really this evolutionary trajectory that we're on. And that's not really the invention of any group, collective, corporation, organization. It's not no Elon Musk, no great billionaire is at the helm of this. The best analogy I know for this is really just the agricultural revolution or even the industrial revolution. Did a bunch of Paleolithic humans get together, sit around a campfire and go, right, what we really need to do is start like planting seeds and tilling crops and settling down and building huts. This will be great. I tell you, the future will be awesome if we do this. That never happened. What happened is the environmental niche changed. Humans adapted to the changes in their environment to eke out an existence so that they could continue to extract energy from their environment and survive. And this is very much what's happening now. We're in a novel environment. Our world, our ecosystem, our culture is changing very, very rapidly. And we're sort of scrambling to just kind of keep pace with those changes. And we're doing a bunch of stuff that we don't know if it's a good idea and we don't really know if it's going to work, but it is sort of pushing us along this trajectory of more technology being infused in our lives.
Well, I want to return to your idea of this anti-anthropocentrism vaccine, that idea that you posed, because everything you're saying there suggests that it was the environment that changed human beings, but human beings now have, to a large degree, the decision-making power to decide how the environment goes, how their biology goes. And then the question becomes, and I'm going to turn to you, Steve, it's like, if we start realizing that we might have the power of gods, and ironically a lot of transhumanists don't believe in gods, how do you wield that power? How do you intelligently negotiate that new reality, I guess?
Okay, what I would say is this is where I think the difference between transhumanism and posthumanism makes a difference. These terms are often used interchangeably, but I do think the key difference in terms of this discussion is that transhumanism basically believes that whatever ideals we associate with being human ought to be extended indefinitely into nature, including uplifting animals and uploading our minds into machines and all that, because we sort of believe that the things that we have historically valued in humans ought to be everywhere. And that is kind of how I see transhumanism. Posthumanism is about saying that's a mistake and that's going to kill us, right? And posthumanism, at the end of the day, is about decentering the value, right? Decentering our conception of value from specifically the human to something more generic, perhaps, like living, like life, right? And so biodiversity and the ecology and the environment and so forth. One of the consequences of which may be that we have fewer human beings on the planet, right? That the human beings, as it were, aren't as assertive in terms of putting their imprint on the planet, in terms of the Anthropocene and stuff like that. And it seems to me that we are kind of in this crossroads at the moment. And both of these ideas, transhumanism and posthumanism, have a scientific backing for them. Okay, so I don't think it would be fair to say that one or the other is more scientific than the other. They're equally scientific, but they're interpreting the science differently, and it has to do with the extent to which the human, right, as we have understood it historically, ought to be the center of value. And I think transhumanism pretty much takes that for granted. I think that's fair to say. It takes that for granted, and posthumanism questions that. And as a result, you get a variety of responses about, what the future of humanity should be under some kind of post-human realm, including some who say we should minimize the presence of humanity, right? I mean, that's also part of the post-human future.
It's interesting to note that there is actually quite a lot of shades between transhumanism and posthumanism. I think it's very likely that if I start uploading myself and other people start uploading themselves, within a few weeks, people will have started hacking and editing their brains and they're no longer going to be quite that human. They're going to maybe retain important forms of humanness, but after a few months, we are going to have something very, very different that we probably can't even predict from the start. And similarly, thinking about if we decenter from humans and say maybe ecosystems is what matter, we might still want to do very grand things. I have a paper out in an environmental ethics journal where I'm looking at the instrumental value of humanity for putting up a solar shield in about 1 billion years to keep the biosphere from overheating. So in the ecocentric perspective, humanity doesn't necessarily matter at all. Only the biosphere matters. But suddenly, from an instrumental standpoint, a species that can actually build robots and put stuff in space is quite... Yeah.
Everything matters.
Well, that is the interesting thing, because if from that very extreme post-human perspective, suddenly humans are supposed to be doing mega-scale engineering, which at the very least from an ethics standpoint is interesting, especially because most ecocentrists never want to think weird thoughts like that. But me and my fellow transhumanist co-author, of course, had great fun writing that paper. I think actually the shades between transhumanism and posthumanism, there is quite a lot of interesting mixtures, and many of them are wonderfully weird, and I think we should be exploring those.
Well, Elise, does it feel like we have to travel through all of these different elements of technological progress to get to the sorts of futures that Steve and Anders and yourself in the book are talking about? Or do you think we'll end up just leapfrogging stuff? Is half the transhumanist conversation about mind uploading or robots or the longevity or whatever it's going to be? A lot of that stuff won't even factor because we'll just be taking these massive leaps as soon as we're able to do these sorts of things.
We have no idea. No, anyone who claims to give you an answer to that is bullshitting you. We do not know. I think the thing where leapfrogging often comes in, I think, is in the discussion of AI. So if you're talking about the various technologies that could be used to enhance our cognitive capacities, enhance the speed at which we do technological R&D, then often there's these two competing strands of the biological enhancement strand and then the AI and silicon strand. And I think it's often argued that it's much quicker, you would expect it would be much quicker and more efficient to upgrade intelligence just purely by training algorithms, throwing more compute at them, making them smarter, than doing something like iterated embryo selection, where you're kind of crossbreeding for more and more intelligence over time. Then you implant the embryo that's selected to have enhanced intelligence, and then you're sort of accelerating the biological process. That still requires you to gestate fetuses, grow their brains for 20 years into something vaguely mature, and it's still just a much slower process. So that's where leapfrogging often comes in. But in terms of like which specific technologies is mind uploading a waste of time, again, I think the philosophical richness that transhumanist brings is that it encourages us to consider our own uncertainty, a range of possible future scenarios, possible technologies, possible pathways to enhancement. And I think the correct level of humility to have there is that we're definitely going to be wrong about a bunch of it. And especially when it comes to the minutiae. The more fine-grained you get in terms of in 20 years, there'll be this technology and it'll affect our lives this way, and I can describe what it'll be like to go to a doctor's appointment and have blood drawn or walk down a city street or go on a date. The more fine-grained you get with your predictions, the more aspects of them will be wrong. But there's so much value to doing that big picture thinking, future scoping, where you go, okay, I can imagine what it would be like to have an AI that could talk to me like Siri or Alexa as seamlessly as I'm talking to you now, and to not make the errors that ChatGPT and the other systems we have in the world make now. Thinking through like what the knock-on consequences of that could be for individuals, for governments, for institutions, for education, for our life scripts. I think there's huge value to doing that while saying we're going to get a bunch of the nitty-gritty wrong.
Well, we're all talking as if the transhuman future is something that's going to happen to us. But Steve, I want to ask you about our freedoms and what we're actually able to do, because there is a useful philosophical term that comes from transhumanism called morphological freedom, which actually suggests that some of the power for what sorts of ways of being may emerge is in our hands, that we can start making decisions over how we want to present as human in the world.
Yeah, I mean, this is very big topic. I actually think what if you want to think about at the most general level, the contribution of transhumanism, especially when we talk about these normative issues about how one should live and so forth, it's the idea of morphological freedom, which comes from Max Moore, and I and my co-author Veronica Lipinska have developed in the proactionary imperative, and it's the idea that you can be human in many different kinds of ways. And certainly the way I think about this is as a continuation of the general tendency in the history of humanity, especially in the modern era, of people being able to transition between the status from which they were born to the status that they want to be, right? And we can talk about class mobility in this regard. And nowadays we're talking about gender mobility and perhaps even race mobility. And we can also talk about substrate mobility. And it seems to me that all of this is quite continuous with the history of liberalism, right, within the history of the West. And it makes perfect sense. And what lies in the balance with this is the issue of recognition, right? Whether one is recognized as being the new person they are, right? Because typically when you become the new person, whether you've shifted your class or shifted your gender, right, or shifted your nationality or shifted whatever, right, there will be signs that you came from somewhere else. And the issue is going to be whether you're recognized in the new identity. And it seems to me that transhumanism, if it wants, in terms of what it does, in terms of making a powerful political statement in the world in which we live now, even before any of this uploading stuff happens, it will be to push this line, it seems to me. And so transhumanists should be in favor and promoting trans generally, right? And that seems to me, in terms of the current political discussions, where the transhumanists be. And for those of you who are interested in a kind of precedent for this, right, Martine Rothblatt, right, would be the person to look to as someone who, starting in the 1990s, was talking about the apartheid of sex, okay? And she is really one of the pioneers of this idea of morphological freedom, talking about this from a personal standpoint. See, this is where I think sometimes we get, in a way, clouded by all the technology and the gizmo stuff. Right. Whereas, in fact, what we're talking about with transhumanism is a kind of long-term trajectory of human emancipation, right, where people can in some way go from their origins to some other place. And this is why I'm always a little resistant or concerned about people who want to rely on evolutionary theory as a basis for transhumanism. Because evolutionary theory ultimately gets you back to the origins, gets you back to the descent. And what you want to do is break away from it. And this is where I think there's a real tension, and it's a real scientific tension with regard to transhumanism's relationship to biology.
So Elise, why do you think it's almost taboo to imagine that the human being could survive and perhaps even flourish in a different material or substrate form?
I don't think it can. I don't think once you're in a different substrate that you are human. I think what transhumanists are talking about with futures that involve AIs uploading, merging with machine intelligence, those are post-human futures. And I think that we're in slight semantic danger here of eliding two different types of post-humanism, which is an academic minefield that I promise I won't drag you down because it's really quite dull. But really, when most transhumanists talk about the post-human, they just mean something that has evolved beyond the biological limitations of the human being, something that has been enhanced so much that it's no longer recognizably the same entity. So yeah, essentially these futures where we're more or other than human, this is not retaining a human state. We really, really are talking about using technology to generate a new form of existence for intelligent life. And then, Steve's got lots of ideas about the moral basis of that, or the benefits of that, involving emancipation from, I guess you could say, aspects of biological design. I think that's something that all transhumanists basically share. So that this idea of morphological freedom that Steve's talking about really is just this idea that it's almost quite a libertarian idea, really, just that you're free to choose to do with your own body what you wish to do. So if you want to inject yourself with CRISPR and change your DNA, that's morphological freedom. If you want to implant an antenna into your skull, or if you want to include technologies that give you different senses and ability to perceive infrared, that's morphological freedom. And this obviously bleeds into things that are very topical, transgender issues at the moment. But I think Steve may be at risk of eliding something there in terms of the freedom to choose your own identity is not quite the same as the freedom to materially augment and transform your own body.
So when I wrote my own paper on morphological freedom, I took a very, very libertarian view. I was very much card-carrying libertarian at the time and was basing it on a very standard human rights perspective, which now, after being exposed to the philosophy faculty for a number of years, gets awfully complicated. But one of the things I was arguing there is, of course, this is a negative right. I have a right to do with my body as I wish, but I don't necessarily have to demand of others that they help me in doing this. And I felt that is kind of a proper libertarian way of arguing.
Don't you think they should recognize you?
Yeah. So this is the point where I think you're totally right. And indeed, I gotten various criticism from people say, no, in order for this right to be a real right, it must be a positive right. And I was, of course, just chuckling to myself because I didn't want to make a too extreme argument. This was back in the early days where this was way more radical. So if others want the NHS to cover antennas in the head, fine, that's great. You guys do the political hard work on that. But I do think this recognition part is interesting, and that is also perhaps necessary for actually getting to the kind of proper post-human states. Because if I want to enhance myself by changing my skin color to green and having an antenna or some whiskers, that's not terribly radical. It doesn't change really many of my fundamental functions. If I got rid of my need for sleep, that was doable and positive, that would probably still not change it. But if I removed aging or enlarged my working memory so now I could think thoughts that were possibly impossible for humans to think before, at that point I would getting into the post-human realm. But in order for that to work, I probably need a support structure of not just friends that can tell me if this is working or whether I'm just telling myself it's working and doing placebo science, but also a society that is somewhat okay with having a crazy cyborg as a neighbor.
I want to say something about the issue of recognition, right? About recognizing alternative forms of humanity or whatever, or post-humanity. I think the issue here is that when we're talking about so-called normal cases, we actually don't ask a lot of questions, right? So, for example, one of the things I find fascinating, let's say about the trans thing, and this also applies to the kind of Turing test issues with regard to androids and so forth, is that we often use a standard that's much higher than we would on beings that we would normally just pass. Right? If we start by saying, this is a robot, or this is a transgender person, is it of that other gender? Right? You already stack the deck against them. Whereas when we're talking about so-called normal people, right, we don't ask those kinds of questions. We just judge them on their face. And if they pass, they pass. Right? If you remember Blade Runner, right, one of the things is that these replicants, right, are very high quality, right? So you have to develop an extra special Turing test to catch them because you presuppose they are not human. Now, we shouldn't be operating that way. This is my point. We shouldn't be operating that way. And I think to a certain extent, one of the things I would hope that transhumanism does is, in a sense, to treat the issue of recognition much more closely to the issue of passing with regard to the kinds of social arrangements in which we would want to incorporate these people and not worry about their genitals or their origins or anything of that sort. And I would think this would be an enormous benefit of transhumanism, is in a sense to look at whether they fit into the world in which they're in, right, given the kinds of things we normally expect of people. Treat it at that and not be concerned about the origins. And there, I think transhumanism could make some serious progress, and all this stuff about morphological freedom could actually get some political payoff. Because otherwise, morphological freedom just becomes, you can do what you want, but at the end of the day, you're still going to be tested by the traditional standards.
So what you're suggesting there, Steve, is the transhumanist project should be one that widens the catchment of what classes
Of course.
as human.
Of course. And the fact that things, that things pass through the Turing test that you didn't expect them to, that should be taken as okay. That should be taken as a lesson to sort of expand your conception of what the human is. Because if an android or if in a machine, that becomes so sophisticated that even after the most sophisticated tests that even ordinary humans could not pass, they could pass, and yet they're androids, they're humans. This is my view. Because this is how citizenship, naturalization, any of you who've ever come from other countries, this is the score. And it seems to me this is the way we should treat morphological freedom.
So, Elise, where do you stand on that idea?
The idea of
What Steve was just suggesting, this constant expansion of the term, I guess, human, or the category of human.
I think we're in great danger of getting deep into the weeds here. The classification of human and non-human and any taxonomy, there are arbitrary elements of where you draw the line, where they get renegotiated over time. It can be interesting to have these sorts of debates of like, is a machine human? Is this person who is identifying as a different gender or a different sex really what they claim to be? This becomes something that is less important, I think, than how we functionally treat entities that I would say have personhood. And I think the concept of personhood is so much more important than we should call the machines human, damn it, and we should call all the things that have some aspect of sentience human. It's much more important, I think, to just expand circles of empathy so that we can attribute care and compassion to animals, to things that are non-human, to things that have the capacity to suffer. But that epithet of personhood, I think, becomes much more useful than any other I know of. That I think you can attribute personhood to a machine that exhibits all the qualities of human cognition. So materially, it is not a human being. It is not part of the biological chain of evolution that we have come through. I don't think you can reasonably argue that that's human. And there might be something you're trying to include it in by attaching that epithet to it. But then you get into this fuzzy logic territory of denying aspects of scientific reality, I think, and biological reality there that are not helpful. They actually make our categories too fuzzy.
But
and we
human
lack the
existed
ability to function.
before Homo sapiens. The idea of human existed before it was targeted at a specific upright ape.
How could the idea exist before humans could conceive of it?
No, sorry. The notion of humanity is something that is in Greco-Roman and it's
the Greeks
part of
and the Romans were Homo sapiens, were they not?
Well,
No,
they didn't
you're
have
missing
a
the
concept
point.
of being a species Homo sapiens. I think it just shows maybe we need a few extra terms here just to separate. But that's a bit like inventing new pronouns, of course. It's going to be a grammatical headache, but we might need it conceptually. But I do agree with Steve that, of course, the Romans were humans biologically, but they didn't treat themselves as a species. They were just thinking that we're humans. And we can certainly imagine other aspects. We might say so-font sapiens or invent whatever categories we want. One issue is what kind of machines and systems are going to be citizens, for example. And do you have to be a person to be a citizen? We can solve that in very different ways.
Well, before we end up completely down that bottleneck, there's one thing that we haven't included here, which is the idea of risk. So if we're going to have these transhuman futures, it's going to require some action. And that action is going to be highly risky. And when we talk about existential risk, and when the Future Humanity Institute talks about existential risk, they often use it as a noun. The existential risks that may happen to us. But I know you, Steve, and others are more interested in existential risks as a verb, the existential risks that are worth taking. So starting with you, Anders, what risks are worth taking in the 21st century to ensure perhaps our survival in the 22nd?
Well, evolution is ruthless, but it tries a lot of different things, and then it, of course, lets a lot of organisms die, and I think we can do much better than that. But there is something to that idea. We let our ideas die in ourselves. We think through various possibilities and try the ones we think are best. And then our neighbors look at the crazy stuff we do, and sometimes we realize, oh, Anders, that was actually a good idea. I'm totally going to copy that. Or, no, I'm never going to do that, and we all avoid doing that stupid thing ever again. We need to take individual risks. I think we need to actually be less risk averse individually and as groups. But we don't want to risk all our future. I think our future could be very grand, and there are certain things that might risk all of that. But if some people try out a weird lifestyle or try out a weird enhancement, that's great. We should approve of that, even if it ends badly. It's really worthwhile taking these risks and these experimentations because they're kind of local. But there are different kinds of risk. People might not even agree on the evaluation of risk. I might say, I'm going to take that cognitive enhancement pill because I want to think deeper thoughts. And others would say, no, Anders, don't risk your brain. Your brain is too precious. But it's my brain. I get to decide how much to risk that one. But I might still want to listen to my doctor telling me that maybe it's not, that pill is not a good idea with your hypertension. So there is that back and forth about risk. Risk is negotiable. And I think there are only a few ones that are so big existential risks that that's where we need to work very hard on never getting close to them.
There we go. Elise, what risks do you think might be worth taking?
In terms of what risks should we take, only history will be the arbiter of that. In terms of what risks are we going to take in spite of ourselves, we are going to keep building smarter AI systems, and we won't know until some decades hence, perhaps some centuries hence, whether or not we should have.
Let me return actually back to that point, Elise, because you suggest in your book, Future Superhuman, that it might not be a bad thing if human beings are simply the progenitor of some form of non-biological species. That, you know what, if that's the thing that kind of takes intelligence to the cosmos, yeah, that'll be all right.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because we know we have finite time on this planet. We know that there are finite resources, that our sun is not going to be around forever. So surely it behooves us to entertain the fact that the continuation of sentience and intelligence and conscious experience in a form that's not the same as ours, in the same way that we don't have the same experience of the world as a cat or a cockroach or a bacterium, to the extent that it has experience at all. There will be something different, and I think that is okay. And there is something, at least to a human mind, that I find very consoling about the fact that intelligence and experience have the opportunity to continue to find new forms of novelty, new forms of knowledge, and new forms of richness in this thing that we call consciousness. Whether or not that ends up being a good thing, we don't know. But again, that perspective from transhumanism is something. Part of what I do in my book is to try and foreground not that this is the only way that we should think, or that every transhumanist perspective or intervention is the way to see the world, but this huge deficit in our default mode of seeing the world, that we often don't even consider that larger zoomed out perspective. So I'm really ramming home in the book, hey, we know all the obvious stuff of like, love thy neighbor, tend to our own garden, be good in our own communities, all the stuff that's been passed down for hundreds and thousands of years. But here's the perspective that might add something bigger to the way we situate ourselves in terms of what's possible for not just us, but our descendants, and for the thing that is consciousness that in a bigger sense we are all a part of.
I do wonder if we wipe out biological humanity and the aliens come down and all they find is ChatGTP, they're going to think we're really weird.
I think any aliens are going to find us weird regardless.
They're going to be like, this human thing, it's just a chatbot. But Steve, there's an interesting point that you make about taking a proactionary perspective. So how do we do that today?
Okay, well, in terms of the issue about turning existential risk into a verb or something, as you were suggesting earlier, I think the idea here is if we're looking at trying to advance humanity in a proactionary way, which is this term from transhumanism, and Veronica, who's in the audience here, and I have written a book about this, we have to be open to taking risks. And there is a kind of institutional problem, which is research ethics codes within universities and major corporations and so forth in the West, that actually make it very difficult for people, even if they're willing to agree. Right. So even if you've got consenting scientists and subjects who have been made aware of this, there are principled reasons why these kinds of contracts can't happen. OK, and so what ends up happening is people are taking, of course, all kinds of risks, right, underground, right, in the black market or whatever. And of course, there's China and the Russia and all these other places that don't have these kind of spotless research ethics codes that we have in the West. So we don't know what's going on there. And so the point is liberalize the research ethics code to enable people, right, to give informed consent, right, to be able to participate in risky scientific experiments on two conditions. One condition is that even if, so let's say that, and this will probably involve some insurance, right? So that if it's risky, right, there's a possibility that the person involved in it will die or something terrible will happen. So there has to be a sufficient insurance policy, but lawyers can work this stuff out, okay? But the point is, once that all has been worked out, if the person has agreed to this, then whatever happens as a result, right, the scientist isn't brought to court. Right, so there has to be a kind of non-punitive aspect to this, right? So in other words, if someone agrees to take an enormous risk, they've signed the contract, they've understood what's going on, they take the risk, right? And let's say they die or something terrible happens, the scientist is not brought to court. That's one point. The other point is that the results of this research need to be made public. That's the other problem, right? And that's the problem, I think, generally speaking, with a lot of even supposedly, research that's legal, right, is that the people who conduct the research, right, are able to control the findings that are in fact made public. And so as a result, it becomes very difficult to learn, especially learning from failure. Because in a sense, I think one of the things that we have to be open to, if we're going to be talking about being open to existential risk and so forth, is that we need to have a culture that encourages and learns from failure and in a way rewards or in some way recognizes the people who in a sense have sacrificed themselves for it. It's a bit like military service. Only in a kind of transhuman way.
So there we go. Sign up to some hyper-experimental drug trials. If you die, you'll be celebrated as a hero who is doing it for the betterment of humanity.
It worked for the Soviet Union.
And if you live, you might live forever. So win-win. So we're going to open the floor up to questions. Again, if you could wait for the microphone to come to you before asking your question, that would be helpful. We have a question just here.
Hi, thanks. My name's Alex. Hi, thanks for a wonderful discussion, really interesting. My question's for Elise. I haven't read your book, and I certainly will after tonight. But I'm really curious to know, given that you talk about sort of decentering humans and being a bit less anthropomorphic, I'm curious to know sort of what your meta-ethics are and to what extent you think human values, like contemporary human values, are highly contingent, or to what extent they've sort of converged on something that's really true and valuable. And with respect to AI, how important it is then to tightly align artificial intelligence to like contemporary human values.
I'd love to give you a really tight, precise answer to that question, but it's a minefield, and I'm awash with uncertainty about it, to be perfectly honest. In terms of aligning AI to current human values, I'm a deep skeptic about AI alignment, which is ironic given my place of work at the Future of Humanity Institute. I think it's wonderful that people are that a subset of humanity is dedicating time to thinking about whether it is possible to align AI's incentives with ours, and just working on this idea of getting it to effectively interface with us so it can understand our commands to the letter, so that if you say, get my grandmother out of the burning building, it doesn't go, okay, I'll blow up the gas main under the building. Grandmother no longer in the building, job done, terrific. There's all this like semantic slipperiness with AI that is hugely concerning for where it takes us. But in terms of, aligning it to human values, there's the safety concern of alignment there, which seems obviously extremely important. But then in terms of the broader set of values, in terms of what we value from conscious experience, things that I think are more emotionally driven, I think that's the thing that is really most interesting about this and speculating about it. Would AIs that are super intelligent or as intelligent as us have a cognitive architecture, given that they're non-biological, of needing emotions in order to make decisions? Because emotions obviously for humans have adaptive value. There's a reason that they're there. They're not just for fun or to make us mad or to be a pain. And Marvin Minsky, I think the great AI scientist, had hypotheses about emotions actually needing to be encoded in AI at some point. I think that's just a really interesting line of thought, and I wish I knew more about it. I think Anders is actually probably a better person to ask about some of it, because he deep dives way, way more than I do. But in terms of like, how should we live and what would the value of being alive be to an AI? I'm just kind of skeptical that when you're getting in the territory of orders of magnitude smarter than a human being, is going to have preferences that just make sense to a human being. I think our preferences would make sense to them. It would almost be like we would be a small bit of a concentric circle and they're the larger circle that can encompass us with that amount of intelligence, in the same way that we can sort of understand the motivations of animals to some extent. I might, if Anders wants to have a crack at that, see what you think.
I don't think I have a profound thing to say about whether you need to have emotions in AI. I think it's likely that we get something emotion-like. Reinforcement learning is, for example, a very popular way of making AI systems that learn how to find solutions. And there you have stuff like surprise. Something was more valuable than expected. There are disappointment. Something was less valuable than expected. And you might argue that we might be counterparts to at least some of our emotions there. But many of our social emotions, of course, don't make sense to an entity that only exists in a world of chess games. So yeah, it's very unclear what would generalize. In the space of all possible minds, I would expect that there are some minds that have emotions, others that have alien emotions, and most that don't have anything recognizable. But that space is so big that you can't say anything useful about it. The really interesting thing is minds that can thrive in this universe. What values do they have and what metaethics do you need for that? And unfortunately, I think you need to be 10,000 times smarter than me to figure that one out.
The only thing I would say about this discussion is I think the issue of emotions with regard to human beings is also pretty dodgy, okay? Because we typically assign emotions with regard to expression of emotion. And of course, as we start to expand our understanding of disabilities that humans have, right? Humans can have all kinds of emotions but are unable to express them. And it seems to me, this is why I would be really resistant to make any of these kind of evolutionary-based blah, blah arguments that you were just making about, whether a machine could be emotional, because we're still working out about the relationship between capacity and expression with regard to human emotion.
If I could take moderator's prerogative, you're talking there about values, but also about human attributes. So a lot of the versions of, I guess it's more machine learning than AI that we're seeing, are bottlenecked through what we expect as a human being from that AI. So in other words, ChatGTP, it has to look like a sort of conversation that a human being would have with another human being, where we're constraining the possibility for new forms of creativity in these tools because we're projecting our expectations onto them. Surely it would be more fun to have a ChatGTP that would teach us something that we wouldn't have thought of, rather than show us something that we were already expecting. And that's why there's this whole kind of meta practice of finding the right questions to ask these chatbots. It's the issue that Douglas Adams worked out years ago. You have to find the right questions to ask the thing to get the answer that you want back. And perhaps it's human intelligence that needs to do a little bit more work when engaging with these sorts of AI, or I guess more machine learning tools. David Wood.
Thanks. I'm David Wood, Chair of London Futurists, an advocate for active transhumanism. Congratulations to the four of you for putting many great topics on the table. My question isn't about the longer-term future or what may happen to us eventually. I want to ask about applications of transhumanist technologies in the next 10 to 20 years, because I believe this is an incredibly dangerous and turbulent time we're in. I don't even want to ask about evidence of longer lives or stronger capabilities or smarter thinking, because I accept the argument Elise has in her book that we're going to need more than just intelligence and energy and longevity to build a better world. So my question is, do you see any prospect for things that are going to make us in this troubled time kinder, more collaborative, more inquisitive, more open, rather than all our terrible human tendencies of egocentrism, divisiveness, being tribal, being hostile? So are there therapies or techniques or tools of various sorts that can come in here? Or is there nothing we can do apart from age-old traditional methods?
I think you're begging the question in an amazing way, actually, because part of what being open to the future is is that a lot of our conceptions of what being open and curious and all the rest of it is up for grabs, right? That is part of the situation we're in now. It's an enormous amount of uncertainty. It's very exciting, but I think it would be a mistake to somehow think that there's some kind of right direction. How do we go from here? It seems to me this is where, in a sense, we live in a sort of ontologically democratic situation, right? Where in a sense, there are lots of different futures that we could be going into. And in a sense, we're living in a period where people have lots of access to information, some of which you or and other people in the audience may not prefer and think they should have other information, but nevertheless, it's all there already. I don't think it's egocentric because people don't have a clear sense of what ego means, right? One of the consequences of our migrating from offline to online is that the idea of personhood and what it means to be a self is blurred. Okay. And this is something the law has to deal with all the time about when is hate speech a threat to your life and all this kind of stuff. The point, you're operating with a lot of old-fashioned categories in terms of your normative perspective. Notions like the ego are out of the room, right? I mean, people are just migrating. They're ontologically migrating and they're informed.
I'm also old-fashioned like David. I actually think a world with more tolerance would be a good world. I'm very willing to stick out my neck with various very classical liberal views, etc. And then Steve and me can have a big argument about how wrong I am. But I'm still going to be looking for, can I make tools for having a better tolerance in online forums? Can we construct better ways of coordinating people? And I do think, obviously we have some technological tricks to do that. Maybe giving everybody oxytocin will make us all nice and cuddly, but it seems much more impractical compared to things like Kickstarter, which allowed people with weird preferences to get together and fund projects. That has enabled a new form of coordination. And I think we can come up with quite a lot of these tools. Then, of course, the other side, the side that doesn't like tolerance, are totally going to work hard on coming up with their tools. So there's still going to be this race. And I'm kind of going to be on the tolerance side and trying to coordinate that and make sure that we win over those intolerant guys. But Steve is going to be laughing at me for being old-fashioned, and that's fine.
So a really brief answer to David. I'm sorry, I'll keep it short. I just think David has asked here one of the most insightful and incisive questions I've ever heard from an audience member, which I'm not surprised to hear. And it's the thing that kind of grinds my gears about transhumanist movements, to be honest, is the fact that very often the transhumanist on the panel will duck and weave that question because it's really hard to give a good answer to, because actually we don't have a good answer to it. And there aren't these silver bullet technologies, at least on the short time scale of the next 20 years, where we can be like, right, there is this promising drug in the pipeline that we have good reason to believe can enhance our empathy without all of these terrible trade-offs and knock-on consequences and unforeseen complexities. This is the thing that within transhumanist movements, I think it's almost like there is a quasi-religious aspect to the selling of it, that just believe it'll all be fine. Don't worry, the tech will come along. And the bit of transhumanism that I take seriously is the meliorism, right? If we work really hard, if we invest more in basic science, if we more rigorously shore up our institutions so that the pursuit of truth is at the forefront of what our societies are built upon, then we have some hope that we can develop some kind of good answer to David's question. But I think it behooves us to acknowledge right now we don't have those things. We don't have a good answer. And I think it's disingenuous to just say, kick back, the technology will solve it.
I love how all of this matters just on the way in which you place emphasis on things. So a technology of control, a drug that everybody's going to take that's going to make them really empathetic, sounds like a lovely idea, but you can easily twist that to be everybody has to take this drug and you're going to be blissed out for life, which is to a large degree, the problem transhumanism is facing right now, where you have individuals like War Room, Trump's advisor, whose name's jumped out of my head. Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon is communicating what transhumanism is to 50% of America, and it's exactly the same thing that the transhumanists who are framing this in a very positive mode are saying, but with a different intonation or a different inflection. You know, and we've seen it already with the uptake or the not uptake of the COVID vaccine. You know, the people don't know what's good for you is a problem that we might encounter and might face. We have a question at the back just here in the center.
Hi, my name is Elle. I have kind of the same question, but two different pathways. So to all of you, I struggle to understand how you think that humanity, just as a species, has this great importance in the universe, that we should be able to rewrite history. Evolution has proven for trillions of years that we survive by like destroying species, them coming back and everything. And now all of a sudden, we're just going to stay like this. No more ice ages, no more anything that's going to destroy the robots. We're just going to keep going as we are, even expanding into other planets throughout the universe. And then also, Steve, to you directly, you are kind of asking a lot of people to be open to your opinions as a group, that this is something that we should develop in our future. But you seem to be quite close-minded to the other people within your circle. So how do you expect the rest of the population to kind of get on board of this transhumanism when you don't seem to be too open to the other people in the room?
Yeah. It's funny that you that you position me this way. I think within the transhumanist community, I'm often seen as kind of a critic or an outlaw within it, right? I mean, because I'm not a true believer. I do think it is a kind of direction of travel, right, that is going on, and my view is it is true. My view is positive, and I want to contribute to that. But I think my fundamental view with regard to what you're asking, and Luke was actually trying to get me to talk about this a little bit earlier on, but we had a different discussion going on, is that I actually think that the distinction between trans and post-humanism is the most important political distinction that's on the table now. Okay. And what I mean by that is that the transhumanists really do want to keep the human as the center of value and amplify those aspects of the human that have evolutionarily distinguished us from animals, right? And amplify it by whatever means possible. You know, put uploading, cyborgs, longevity, whatever. Post-humanists want to decenter the human, kind of what you're suggesting here, right? They basically think the human has gone too far. It's hubris, that we should in fact think of ourselves as just one among many equally valued species on the planet. That is what I take to be the post-humanist position, right? When it really makes sense. And that's where the ecological perspective comes in, and that's where the idea of reining in our, keenness on science and technology and all the rest of it comes in. And I think that distinction is the most politically salient distinction of our time, and I think that there are serious arguments to be had on both sides of that issue. So I am not dismissing the kinds of concerns you're saying, okay? We just haven't talked about them very much. We haven't talked much about, the kinds, where you would come from if you're against transhumanism, but it's very much there, and it very much needs to be discussed, and it cannot be finessed. So you're actually pointing to a very serious, I think, political issue that will be with us for the coming generations.
So humanity might be one species among many others, but we do have some very peculiar ecosystem services. One of them is spaceflight. So I'm currently writing a paper about the concept of directed panspermia, where some people say we have a moral duty to spread life into the universe because most of the universe looks totally lifeless. We are the one species on this planet that actually can build rockets and actually send probes with bacterial spores to other stars with some effort. There are also other people, including my co-author in this paper, that think this is a terrible, terrible idea. We absolutely should not, because we have a moral duty to improve average welfare of other species. which means that we must not spread life because that's going to cause a lot of pain and suffering. It's a very interesting debate, and I don't know how a paper is going to turn out. But the point is, humanity might be a species among others, but we do a lot of very powerful things that are very unusual. We're not the only species who have crashed the climate and the atmosphere. The blue-green algae and the little fernazola have done it independently also. So we're kind of in good company with some plants. But I do think that there is quite a lot of intermediate form between transhumanism and posthumanism. For example, that early idea of cyborgs as a way of surviving in space, that was almost contemporary with another idea, and that was macrolife. This realization that space habitats need to contain an ecosystem and life support systems and could actually be viewed as an integrated higher order organism containing both humans, animals and plants and technology, and that should actually be regarded as an evolutionary step. So together with the kind of individualistic cyborg, you could also have a more collectivistic forms. I think there is a lot of intermediate forms here, and quite often we end up with just transhumans versus posthumans and maybe the normal humans who don't want to play this game at all. But actually there are a lot of intermediate forms, and many of these are most wonderful.
Very quickly, Elise, why should human beings be in the driver's seat, which I think was the core of that question?
I think it was more that that humans are at the center of value, and I actually don't think that they are. I think there's something about transhumanism that actually opens up the perspective of this too shall pass. There's versions of the transhumanist proselytizing that are very much like, you'll get to come along for the great immortal ride. I don't really buy that. I think even should we create life extension techniques that are robust and reliable, the futures that those people or those beings will experience will end up seeding forms of their consciousness and personhood that are no longer recognizably the human that they were. And so I think it is one of the common critiques of transhumanism, that it's this hubris about living forever, that it's people that don't want to die. I think that plays into some of the motivation for some people, but I don't believe that the humanity is at the center of it. I think, as Anders says, there are unique and interesting traits of humanity that we have a clear bias because we're human to think it would be cool if consciousness and intelligence and emotion and experience survive. We don't know whether there's any objective value to that, but it just seems like we have some reasonable reasons to think that it'll be better for consciousness to persist than not.
Hi, thanks everybody. Really great talk. I'm Leslie Ann. So my question is kind of for Steve. So you talk about how we define the human and not defining as the Homo sapien, but going back to an older definition and the human as a state of being. But that old definition of the human is discriminatory and it doesn't include a lot of humans.
Yes.
So enslaved people, women, people with disabilities.
Yes.
So why should we use an outdated, discriminatory, quite Eurocentric version of the human or definition going forward?
Well, that old notion of the human, yes, it did all of that you say, for sure. But generally speaking, that notion of the human, in a way, treated the human as a something one could become, right? So in other words, this is why education made a big difference in terms of the notion of the human in the classical and also in the Christian, Judeo-Christian world, right? Was that this is something you would become through training. And the issue was, who was trainable in some sense. And in this context, if you think about something like Aesop's fables, right, where you have all these animals that exhibit human qualities in various ways. Some of you may know about this, right? The fox and the grapes and all this kind of stuff. Nowadays, we call this anthropomorphic. But anthropomorphic is a term from the late 19th century, once we, in some sense, have started to segregate what is human and what is animal. But if you go back to the ancient world, these animals, I would say, were literally ascribed human qualities, okay? And certain upright apes could also be ascribed these qualities, right? So human in that sense was a kind of free-floating predicate that could apply to many different kinds of beings, okay? And it was discriminatory, to be sure, okay? But the point was it was also free-floating. So it actually captured more, in a certain way, ontologically, than we would see today, even though it didn't capture every upright ape, you might say, right? And see, this is where the 18th century makes a difference, where we start to make this very clear identification of having the quality of being human with a specific kind of embodiment. And that creates a whole new set of problems with regard to embodiment, because we're talking about upright ape, we're talking about Homo sapiens, and then all other sorts of discrimination starts to enter into it. But this would be the whole history of humanity. But the point is, it does make a difference, I think, metaphysically, whether you think of human as a kind of free-floating quality that could apply to many differently embodied creatures versus thinking of human as attached to Homo sapiens, a particular kind of bodied. That's the only point I'm making here. But I grant the point that the use of the word human has been discriminatory.
One last question here.
Hello, I'm Veronica Lipinska. Fascinating debate. Thank you to all four of you. I mean, want it or not, transhumanist kind of origins very much linked to the kind of Abrahamic tradition, Christianity, and that kind of centricity of human is very much linked to the idea that we're special as opposed to other species. So you can make very direct links to kind of religious background, and in a way, a lot has been said about transhumanism. Is it a religion, or is there a belief, or is it direction of travel? I think it's all of these things. But I want to go back to embodiment, because it seems what a lot of the debate has centered around. Are we kind of transposing the embodied human being, or are we, in a way, extracting an essence of human character, putting into kind of non-organic form? What is it that we should be putting? What is that we should be extending? What is human? So my question to the panel is, a lot of the transhumanists, and Alois made absolutely wonderful points about transhumanist community being absolute shambles. I couldn't agree more. A lot of people become transhumanists because something fails in their body. Yeah. So we're looking at Natasha Vita-Moore, suffered a miscarriage, became a transhumanist because her body did something she didn't want it to do, and she started investing emotionally into the essence of her brain. Ray Kurzweil, tragic death of his father, now tries to create a hologram of his now dead dad. You scratch the surface of a lot of transhumanists and you see the failure of the human body. So the question becomes about embodiment. Can we detach in any meaningful way from the body in a transhumanist way?
I became a transhumanist because Sweden in the 1970s was boring. So I read all the science fiction novels, and then I wanted to make them real, so I read the science books, and then I ended up in academia. So I don't have that annoyance with my body. It was more annoyance with the boredom. What isn't there more to life than in the welfare state? Then I think the body is interesting because it's the interface between the mind and the outside world. The mind might have to need to run on the body, but that interface happens whatever you build the mind out of, whatever the substrate is. If you're a neural network running on a supercomputer, you have your virtual avatar in your virtual environment, or your robot body or something. That is your embodiment. What you really want to preserve is the pattern that matters inside your mind, and the right kind of relationship to the outside world. This is why many transhumanists wouldn't jump into Nozick's experience machine, because they want to have a right relationship to the outside world, even though it might be pleasant inside the experience machine.
Yeah, I mean, briefly, I would say that my peak enthusiasm for transhumanism was, I would call it the twilight of my 20s. And this growing realization, I think, a lot of thinkers in their 20s, whether it's Marxism, socialism, environmentalism, some kind of ism where they're just like, big ideas, fascinating, they're about changing the world, oh my God, tell me more. I definitely had that experience. And I think I'm at a juncture where I think I've been alive in the world and had enough experiences. I think the age, particularly between 20 and 30, you undergo so much experience in evolution, much more than you do, I think, between 30 and 40 or 40 and 50. And the realization for me suddenly, push back from the audience. Okay, it's coming. Crap. All right, well, I look forward to it. Experience is good. But the dawning realization that the mind and the body are so deeply interwoven, and this Cartesian separation, this idea that you can sort of annex your thoughts from the meat sack, I think is is a fascinating vision that I remain super interested in. And I think the philosophy around mind uploading and head in a jar and then being able to be embodied in a kind of VR simulation, I hold space for all of those possibilities. I'm glad people talk about them. I find them really, really interesting. But I think divorcing the mind from the body in terms of the only model we have of consciousness that we know that works, which is the biological model, it's not clear that that is possible. It may well be possible, but then I think it's likely to be much more difficult, again, than a lot of the transhumanist visions have sold us.
Well, Veronica's right in terms of the kind of point she's raising. And it seems to me that if one wants to look at the future of transhumanism, if one's a campaigner for it, I would say, look at people, we have this increasing population of so-called disabled people, okay? And these people can, in fact, be enhanced by cyborg means and stuff like that. And they are the natural pool for transhumanism. And in fact, the kind of people who are attracted to it, right, usually in some sense think that there's some misalignment between their minds and their bodies. It's not that they think their minds are disembodied in some kind of heavenly way, but rather they think they're in the wrong body, right? Or they need to have their bodies enhanced and so forth. They need to have their bodies changed, and perhaps quite radically, in order for their minds to find a full medium of expressiveness. And it seems to me transhumanism can be very much in the forefront of that, right? Even now, because there is already a lot of political activism surrounding that.
So we've jumped around looking at all of these terms, whether it's transhumanism or humanism, post-humanism, and everything in between. But very quickly, my final question to each one of you is if you had to pick out one thing that is just wonderfully incredible about the human as it exists today, what would that one thing be? Leave us with a little bit of hope. Anders, starting with you.
Well, hope is actually quite an interesting quality in itself. I think when you think about hope, it's not about probability so much. It's not about planning. It's actually about this aspiration for a better world is possible. And I think we are one of the few hopeful creatures on this planet, and we need probably to make more hope.
The obvious and best answer is love, but I'll second it with curiosity. I think our ability to be curious and to pursue the answers, to want to know what's real, to build better models of reality, to try and find out why things are the way they are, I think that's absolutely amazing.
That's a tough one. I would say our kind of ability to learn from recklessness, because I think we're inherently reckless. But we learn from it, and so in a sense, the proportion of our species that we sacrifice at any given moment to a war or some kind of awful thing is never total, so that the ones who remain can always learn and do better in the future.
Well, I hope we've been wonderfully reckless this evening. I hope it's given you a little bit of hope on the future of humanity. And I hope you love us and you don't hate us after this conversation. So on that note, I don't even know if I'm human anymore. But I do want to say thank you for joining us for the Futures Podcast Live. I just want to say a massive thank you to King's Place for hosting us this evening, to the outstanding technical team, Marcel and Giuseppe, the front of house staff, and a special thank you to Rebecca, Sally, Fraser, Sue, James, and Lexi for making this possible. Elise's new book, Future Superhuman, Our Transhuman Lives in a Make or Break Century, is available to purchase from the back of the room. Steve's latest book, Nietzschean Meditations, Untimely Thoughts at the Dawn of the Transhuman Era, is also available. And Anders' forthcoming book will soon be written by Sim Anders. It's going to be called Grand Futures, and nobody knows when that's coming out. But I assure you it is coming soon.
But they don't have to pay anything at this point.
Yeah,
we're going to be a post-scarcity future where everybody will read it.
It will be read by ChatGTP before you ever get a chance. So if you like what you've heard, then you can download the Futures Podcast on all your favorite podcasting apps, or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at Futures Podcast. More episodes, live events, transcripts, and show notes can be found at futurespodcast.net. Please put your hands together and join me in thanking our incredible panelists.